The NEC member, Tony Yengeni, says that today's meeting will ensure that Ramaphosa respects the country's constitution.
The NEC is expected to convene this afternoon, get a report from the officials, discuss the matter that will be presented to us, and come to certain conclusions. And I think that in that regard, some of us will be insisting that the president must not only uphold the rule of law and the constitution, but he must respect the law and the constitution of the republic. He must respect the people of South Africa. He must respect the country and the government.
Let's get the thoughts of an ANC veteran now. We're now joined by Mavuso Msimang. Dr. Msimang, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. Please do indulge me in trying to understand what is happening today. Allow me to go back and maybe make it a little bit personal. Do you remember when you joined the African National Congress and what attracted you to the organization?
I joined the African National Congress definitely long before you were born. It was in 1958. What was most attractive about the ANC was that it had emerged during the decade of the 50s, from 1952, 51 even, to 1960. There was a lot of activity. There were issues like the Defiance campaign, which was led by Mandela. You had the prison trial, you had the Freedom Charter. Later you had the PAC breaking off to finances to found itself. In fact, it was during that time that I appreciated the depth of the ANC, its ideology, much broader than just Africans, but saying legitimate people who are legitimately in South Africa and were contributing to it must be regarded as citizens. Hence, South Africa belongs to all who live in it. I found that very fascinating.
And you take a look at the ANC of 2022. Can you still find that depth? What is the ideology?
There is a lot of depth in the ANC. The real problem is that we have really been highly factionalized as a result of mistakes that were made about the absorption of new people into the ANC. I think positions that were taken around looking after the interests of the people who voted us into government in the first instance. The issues of self-interest really became so paramount that we began to lose our way, and we've now, you can't talk about the ANC and not think about factions. It hits you in the face all the time, and we've not been able to overcome that. And we have a history over the past 5 more years of failing to deal with corruption, which has eroded the confidence of the people in the ANC. And this is what the ANC has to grapple with as we go forward.
These issues of factions, what would you put them down to, especially if we take a look at the question of ideology? You speak of the ANC of some over 60 years ago when you spoke of the depth and the ideology of the ANC at that time and the common vision that was being pursued. What is the vision that is being pursued in 2022 where the party stands accused of not having checked nearly enough things on its list that have made a tangible impact to the majority of the people of this country?
Much was done by the ANC since the achievement of freedom in 1994. There were compromises, by the way, that needed to be done, and I never for one day blame people who made compromises. In controversies, we did not march on the streets to Pretoria to overthrow the army of the apartheid army. There was an opportunity to reduce the killing of people and to achieve what the ANC always wanted to achieve, namely freedom for the black people, freedom for all. Nothing has changed in theory, and to some extent in some practice, with respect to the stated objectives of the African National Congress. It is to achieve a democratic country, to give power to people who have been disempowered over centuries, and to make sure that there is good governance in the country. So in theory, these things have not changed. The ANC has not changed its ideology to espouse right-wing or left-wing ideological positions. But what has happened is that we've allowed into the leadership people whose interests really center on themselves, first and foremost. We have lost many of the people who joined the ANC in order to serve the people. And it sounds very generic, but when somebody starts making use of their position in the ANC, of their being a member of the ANC, to gain advantage of accumulating wealth, of serving themselves ahead of the people, that is really what has cost us the popularity, the support that the people gave us unflinchingly, even in the most difficult of times. You are aware that we've been associated with corruption. Really, there is no other word for it. Talk about the era before Cyril Ramaphosa came into government. It was dominated, the dominant narrative about that period is state capture, meaning that private interests just infiltrated the ANC, took over, having come in at the highest level, and effectively, to a very large extent, ensured that their interests were served by, among other things, the appointment of people to positions that were very strategic to their interests.
Tony Msimang, you mentioned state capture. I'm sure there's going to be a phrase that will be birthed out of this entire process once it is concluded. For now, it goes by the tagline, the most popular Phala Phala Farmgate, Phala Phala scandal. You had the arms deal, you mentioned state capture, you mentioned that era, but it's not something that was exclusive to that era. And so this corruption that you speak of, is it endemic in the ANC of some 65 years ago that you were attracted to? Did you see what you are seeing today?
No, well, for one thing, we didn't have power, we didn't have access to resources. I'm not saying that if we did have that, the leaders would have abuse that. But I want to say that if, people fail to manage power unless you are self-disciplined. There is a lot of wrong you can do because you wield power. It's always important that you put in place processes, checks and balances that make sure that you are not allowed, you cannot easily take advantage of having power. Some of these things were simply waived when accountability among peers seemed to disappear, and people were allowed, to do things that were in conflict with the principles of good governance. When they kept quiet about that, state capture took place over a long period of time. And more than just the monies that were stolen, billions of them, you also had what to me was the more devastating thing, the destruction of the capacity of the state, certainly, yes, to carry out. They call it the hollowing out of the state, when people who had the authority to appoint, for instance, board chairmen, board directors, chief executives in state-owned organizations used that to serve ulterior motives, not for the purpose of making those, strengthening the capacity of those institutions to deliver. You mentioned Phala Phala. You know, Phala Phala was really, I think it's the saddest development, I think, in the past few years that has happened to South Africa. The president, Cyril Ramaphosa, it's often argued that he did not steal any money, and absolutely didn't steal money as far as we know. He didn't do what Zuma and other people who have since been charged by the Zendo Commission and other institutions of law. He didn't do that, but what he did do, the recklessness with which he allowed himself to do things that the recent panel, Section 89, found to be, they said he's answerable for that. And so it must be investigated. This is a big crisis. It's big not because it's worse than state capture. It's big because it destabilizes the state. You know, it has put this country in a state of almost paralysis. We still soldier on, but you know, Phala Phala is bad for the nation. It's bad for the ANC, and it's bad for President Ramaphosa. So the attention now has been focused on it, and people wonder, how can the person who came to the leadership of the ANC, top leadership of the ANC, vowing that he would deal with corruption, how are you going to be able to discharge that with all the swords of Damocles hanging over his head? So it has incapacitated him to a very large extent, and that's tragic for our country, and really we're in trouble because of that. And a solution needs to be found as soon as possible. It looks like the president would like to take this outcome on review. I think he has every right to do that, and he must be encouraged to do that. But that must not happen while to the detriment of the nation, while he sits in office, in other words, because he just will be a lame duck sitting there. If he's stepped aside and pursued and exercised his rights to make sure that justice is dispensed, I would support that very strongly. But right now, I hear people talking about, no, he must do that by all means. He must be allowed to respond if he doesn't think the findings are fair. But we must not, as so many people do, argue for retaining him simply because the ANC has failed to develop a credible succession plan, because what we see, that's what people say, is worse than Cyril Ramaphosa. He's the best of what we say is not a good lord. The nation should not be made to suffer because the ANC has failed to manage its leadership succession.
But Mavuso Msimang is an ANC veteran. Thank you, sir.